No mai, haere mai, piki mai, kake mai, kia ora e tiwi, and welcome to 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We do 30 minutes with one guest and no cut, so what we record is what you get. Eugene Ryder, he was abused in state care at an age when most of us were in primary school. He robbed a bank at 16, he drifted into a world where sexual abuse and violence and patch gang members were just the way life was. But somehow he escaped. He's just been awarded a King's Service Medal for his role in the Royal Commission into Abuse and State Care. He's a qualified social worker and he works to keep gang members off meth. How did he do it? And what can we learn from his experience? Let's start the clock. 30 minutes with Eugene Ryder. Eugene Ryder, welcome to 30. Thanks for coming in.
Kia ora.
You've lived a lot of your life as an outlaw, really. Are you now part of the establishment? How do people react to you now?
Yeah, I suppose that's one of the risks that I have working in the spaces I work in, because I am accused of leaving the dark side, and then I'm accused by the light side of still remaining in the dark side. So
Is that right?
It's a bit of a thin line that I travel.
Have you left the dark side?
Depends what you call the dark side. You know, people say, have you left the gang? I'm sure I wasn't a gang member for a long time. Am I black power? Yes, I am. They're part of who I am. They're part of my upbringing, and they're part of my whānau. So when people ask me, you know, have you left the black power? I'm like, well, have you left Ngāpuhi? You know, so yeah, it's just part of who I am.
Yeah, we'll dig into that a bit more in a few minutes. But I want to go right back because to understand you, we have to understand what you've been through. You did, 4 years in state care? This is the early 80s. I think you were 11 or so when you went into Wensleydale Boys Home. How did you end up there?
Oh, I didn't. School and me didn't work out, and so I didn't like being at school. And at the time, truancy was a big, you know, clear the streets. And so when I was found walking the streets that during school time, I was taken straight to the boys' home.
By the police?
Or police, yeah. And to be honest, you know, my home life wasn't all roses. So I didn't want to be at home. There was abuse happening in my home. And so I kind of figured that being in state care would separate me from that abuse, but I soon learned different.
So you, at that time, would have preferred to be in state care before you knew what it was actually like than at home?
Oh, definitely. I was too scared to go home. I'd beg the cops not to take me home. I knew I'd get a hiding, you know, and so yeah, sometimes that's what they did, knowing that I'd get a hiding when I got there. And
yet you found another world of sexual abuse in the Wensleydale home.
Yeah.
That was when you were first sexually abused.
Yeah, it was terrible. It was, what I soon learned was that it was normal. You know, boys everyone knew who the abusers were. They generally the night staff, and so yeah, it was hard. Didn't get much sleep when I was at Wensleydale.
And what sort of impact does that have throughout your life to be abused so young? You're a child. You're 11 years old, 12 years old.
Yeah, I suppose, you know, retrospect is great. For me, it started making me think that that's what it meant to be Māori, that it happened to everybody, and that was part of everybody's upbringing, you know, and because all the boys that were in there were Māori, you know, the minority were non-Māori, you know, and so I kind of thought, oh, yeah, this is what it means to grow up being Māori.
But that was part of the deal.
Yeah.
And does that stayed with you as a parent? You have that fear that somehow that this might be repeated.
Oh, definitely. You know, when my daughter was born, I refused to be alone with her. I refused to change her. I refused to bathe her. I didn't want to be the person that I thought I'd be, and so that came across to my now wife as a useless dad, as a lazy dad, and you know, it all come to a head one day when she went shopping and was out longer than I expected. She came home, baby was in her soiled nappy. She had been in that for a while. Big argument broke out, and I broke down and told her why I didn't want to be alone with her. And that kind of lifted a lot of hara off me, you know, and from that day I was the only one that fed her. I was the only one that bathed her and changed her. So yeah, it kind of showed me that, because I kept it to myself. There's a lot of embarrassment, but growing up through, you know, through the Black Power and that kind of stuff. I knew some of those guys because I've seen their names on the walls in the homes and the prisons that I've been through, and it was like an unspoken shame. But I knew more that were in that space than weren't. So.
When you spent some time in a number of these homes, right? Wairaka, Hamilton Boys, foster homes, faith-based care. Were they all like that? Were they all bad?
Each and every one of them. It was terrible. But by then it was like numb. I was numb to it. So it was the norm, you know. And I think, you know, one of the things I thought about was that it was violence. So I was learning that violence deals with issues, you know, and so that wasn't a problem for me to dish out violence, thinking that was the way I learned how to do things, you know. I used this analogy of a tool belt, you know, the only tool in my tool belt was a hammer, so everything was a nail, and that's how I used it.
And you were a violent man at that point?
Yeah, I was. I reflected my upbringing. You know, I used to wonder why at primary school I'd get the strap where other boys wouldn't. When I was it got so bad at intermediate school that if I heard a window break in another classroom, I'd march to the principal's office because I knew somehow I'd get the blame, and inevitably I'd get the blame. So I was getting caned every day. So I was, basically getting hit every day.
So you learned that violence was the response.
Yeah.
I've always wondered about the people who staff those homes. I mean, does it attract evil people, or do you think that good people get corrupted because they know that if they abuse these kids, and they were mainly Māori boys, weren't they, that they're going to get away with it? What do you think?
I think they were just evil people. I think about it today, you know, some of these people that back then, if they applied for a job as a social worker today, they'll probably get that job. They didn't have convictions. They weren't caught. And they were what society called pillars of society. So, you know, there are people like ministers that were held highly in communities that were working in those spaces that were abusing boys. And so, yeah, it's hard to try and find a way how we could have stopped that from happening. I suppose when I think about it, you know, every time I cried for help, I was just a little shit that was, you know, how could my word be taken over the word of this good Christian man that was looking after people out of the goodness of his heart. And so I was never believed. So I stopped crying out for help.
I think the last time you were in was Kohitere Boys Home in Devon. You're 15, I think, by this point. Is that where gangs enter the picture?
Yeah, they were always present, you know. So I knew about gangs before I went into Wesleydale, and once I was in there, there were people who I knew their parents were patch members of the Stormtroopers or the KCs or whatever. So the gang thing was familiar to me throughout. By the time I got to Kohitere, there was a group of us that we'd decided we'd kind of support the minority. So if there was one stormtrooper and everyone was Muggle Mob and Black Power, then 3 of us would become stormtroopers and say, right, you know, just to
balance it out, right?
And then by the time I got out, the minority was Black Power. So that kind of stuck with me. And when I got out of Kohitere, I got sent back to Auckland, and I just hit the road to Wellington, looking for my mum and my sisters, who had all been abused. I found out later in life, and they were staying with the Black Power in Wellington. And so it was a natural thing for me to gravitate towards them.
What is the attraction of a gang?
Yeah, I'm not so much. I don't think I was going to something. I think I was coming from something. So and going to something where I could see I had a similar background as everyone there. Like if I walked into, say, the Boy Scouts, I had nothing in common with any of those guys, you know. And so I was going away from this abuse stuff. And that was the closest I could get that could provide me with what I thought was love and support and camaraderie, because I didn't really get that at home. Got a bit of that in the boys' homes, but didn't want to be in a boys' home. So yeah, it was something out in the community that I gravitated to, because I saw I had something in common with everyone that was there.
And did it give you that?
Oh, most definitely. It did. You know, it gave me a sense of belonging. I had an incentive. You know, that this thing, the patch, that was kind of at age 15. I was like, man, I can't wait to get one of those. You know.
So that's pretty important.
It was at the time, and I used to look at some of the members had been in there 10 years. I was going, 10 whole years. Oh my gosh, you know. And so I wanted to be part of that, and you know, and so I wanted to fast track me getting a patch. And when I was 15, they wouldn't let me join. Wasn't until my 16th birthday when Ray Harris at the time said, "Oh, you can join now." So, yeah.
That's Reitu Harris. He was the founder of Black Power, right?
He was, yeah.
In the what, 70s, early
1970.
70s? Yeah, okay. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but there's almost a production line from Boys Home, State Care into Mongrel Mob Black Power. I got some documents from the Justice Department who say that 80 to 90% of Mongrel Mob and Black Power members have been a state ward. So that's an extraordinary number to me.
Oh, it is. It's a pipeline. It's a pipeline. It's a pipeline to prison. Starts at a young age when children are uplifted. And there's this thing, I think about today. The state looks at a whānau or a community, they see a young child there, they deem them unsafe because of their parents. So they take their child and they care for them, for want of a better word. That child grows up in state care, gets all the resources given to them, gets fed, gets clothed, gets housed, everything. And then gets to an age where they leave state care, they inevitably go back to that same whānau where no mahi has been done, and then they have a kid, and then state goes, oh my gosh, look, another unsafe kid. So there's all this resources have been put into a kid after the fact, while the family remains in the space where they're not always in a position to be able to feed, house, or look after their kids. So yeah, it seems an irony, bottom of the cliff stuff.
You talked about some of the supportive elements of gangs and why people might come into them, and we talked a little bit about Reitu Harris, who was a pretty political figure, wasn't he? I mean, I think he stood for mana motahaki at one point. I mean, he was quite into the politics of this. But what is it like now? Because a lot of people will see Black Power as an organised criminal group now. That's certainly how the police view them, right? Are they right?
Not at all. I think, if anything, a lot of the gangs today are guilty of unorganised crime, and there's a lot of unplanned stuff that's happened, and it happens on the spur of the moment. And there is a need. A lot of the guys in the whānau that are in these positions, they're pōhara, they've got no money. A lot of them have got no jobs, and they've got no access to what they see the rest of the world as a participant in. So they resort to what they know best, and they use the only tool they got in their tool belt. So.
And what is that violence, and is it selling drugs? I mean, is that still gang life today? Well,
if that's the environment that you're brought up in, then that's all that exists. If you're brought up in an environment where everyone's a plumber, you're inevitably going to be a plumber, But if you're brought up in an environment where people are selling drugs to get money to do the shopping, then that's most likely how you're going to, I suppose, react to the lifestyle.
You must see a lot of young people who are sort of teetering on that life and whether to go down that path. What do you say to them?
Just keep doing better, for a long time. So I don't think being part of a gang is necessarily a bad thing if you're doing some good things in your life, And I know a lot of people that are in the Black Power and the Mongrel Mob and a number of those communities that are doing great stuff. They're social workers. They're doing some good stuff for their whānau. But good news doesn't make the news, and so it's the minute they do something wrong, front page, so that's, it's terrible.
But to what extent are they dominated by criminal activity? If you look at the Justice Minister, Paul Goldsmith, he said last year that gang members are less than 0.25% of the population, but are linked to nearly 20% of serious violent crime and 20% of homicides and 23% of firearms offences. So whatever the numbers are, it's massively disproportionate, isn't it? A tiny fraction of the population, and yet responsible for quite a lot of crime. So it's hard to see them being a force for good in society, isn't it? Or do you see them in that way?
I definitely see them as a force for good, And those stats,
how do you make that argument, given those numbers?
Well, if you look into those stats, it's not actually gang members, it's people linked with gangs. So that could be father of, brother of, cousin, someone in the same house, But put that aside, I think, there is good among everybody. And I remember being taught this kōrero from Dennis O'Reilly about a guy, Tareha Te Mainanui, first Māori MP to speak in Parliament. He said, there's good, there's evil, focus on that which is good, for good will always overcome evil. And so but no one looks at our whānau and sees and looks for good. They look for their mistakes, and then they kind of make those the focus. And to be fair, if crime is all you know all your life, that's all you're going to be doing, until something good happens in your life where you start considering whether you should continue that path or not.
It's interesting, though, correct me if I misinterpreted you, but you wouldn't dissuade or try to convince a young person not to go into a gang.
No, I wouldn't. But what I would do is give him or offer him opportunities where the hammer isn't the only tool in his belt, and eventually that tool isn't part of his toolbox, you know. So I look at, because everyone's got, you know, everyone's got the capacity to do good. Everyone's got the capacity, but some people think there's this thing called poverty of spirit. They think that all that is all that can be. Can't wait to be 16 because I get the dole. You know, all that kind of thinking. Can't wait to have a kid because then I'll get a benefit for that kid. They're not pitching they're not pitching high enough because they don't believe it, because they don't see anyone, they don't see themselves up there. So that's part of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, so that people can see themselves in the different positions that I'm in and start aspiring to those positions.
And what sort of things are you doing in that space that you think might make a difference?
I'll tell you, you know, I've got a couple of tools in my tool belt nowadays. One of them is diving, scuba diving, the other one's kapa haka. And both of those things have got me out of all the trouble I potentially could have got into. You know, so diving, when I learned how to dive, I was 32 years old. I was what I thought was in the prime of my life as a patch gang member, but I was scared of the water. I was scared to drown. My 9-year-old girl humbled me when she came out of the water with 2 pawas down her togs. She said, "Here, Papa, I know you're scared of the water." And that freaked me out. Very next day, I started a master dive course, and I discovered this whole world out there that can offer not only free kai, but a place of solace. You know, I go there when I'm feeling down, and it lifts me. Now what I'm promoting with the rangatahi that I work with is learn how to do this, and then learn how to give without expectation of receiving. And so for those rangatahi, they all of a sudden, they used to be the little shit in their whānau, and now they're the provider for their whānau. And then they start promoting it. Next minute, they're provider for their marae, for their hapu, for their iwi. So it lifts their aspirations a bit higher.
So who are these rangatahi that you are engaging with, and where do you meet them, or what is their story roughly?
I tell you, you know, for 20 years, I worked at a Decile 10 intermediate school in Wellington, and the majority of them were Pākehā. Every day I looked for the 11, 12-year-old Eugene Ryder. Every day I'd find him, you know, and I go, oh my gosh. And I'd talk to their teacher, they'll go, you need to pay this fellow a bit more attention. And there are 2 responses. A bad teacher would say, I've got 30 other kids in class that get it, so he could just either get it or go to the principal's office. A good teacher would say, well, I've got 30 other kids in class that get it, means I can spend more time with this guy. You know, and I do that. I play sport, I coach, I do kapa haka, I look for Eugene Ryder in all the spaces that I'm in.
And when you're looking for Eugene Ryder at 12 in that boy's eyes, what are you looking for? What are the signs?
I suppose, you know, they're the mischief ones, you know. They're the ones that, you know, they're not going to listen to the teacher. They're not going to listen to the tutor. And sometimes what I've found in life is that the messenger is more important than the message. And I witnessed that when a group of young guys were been given a lecture by a youth aid officer down in Wellington saying, this is why you can't do this shit, this is why you can't do that. And they just looked at him like, who the fuck are you? And then Ray Harris walks in and goes, you just can't do this, you can't do that. And they went, okay, we better not. You know, and so that could be deemed as fear/respect, but it worked for those guys because it was the messenger that was important to them.
You talked a little earlier in the interview about the attraction of the patch being 15. I think at that point, Black Power had said you're too young. I've read that you went out and robbed a bank. Was that to try to get the patch? I mean, is that still the way that it works?
That was my thinking at the time.
You thought, if I rob the bank?
I thought if I rob a bank, get the club all this money, then they'll give me a patch straight away. It had the opposite effect. At the time, what I wasn't noticing was the contracts that the community had with City Council doing some stuff. There was a lot of work happening.
So they didn't like you doing that?
No, not at all. I got a hiding actually for doing that.
And you got jail time too, didn't you?
I got jail time, and even though I was 16, it took my lawyer 2 years to prove how old I was at the time. So I was actually sentenced as what they believed to be an 18-year-old.
And you got, what, 4 years or something?
I got 4.5 years, so I got out just before I turned 21.
And I think you were in prison when your father died.
Yeah, that was a bit of a... that was a moment for me. So I remember I was at Rangipo, I got called to the guard room, and the guard said, oh, do you know your dad's in jail? I was like, yeah. And they go, oh, well, he died last night, go back to your cell. And I was like, what? And it freaked me out. I started, that night, I tattooed my forehead to remind me of that day. And even though I was only 18, didn't have kids, what I was thinking about was intergenerational imprisonment. My dad was in Paremoremo. My brother was in Mount Eden, my sister in Arohata, you know, and I was like, oh my gosh, what the hell's going on? If I ever have kids, this is where it's going to stop, and so yeah, didn't turn into an angel overnight, but I started thinking about what I was doing and the consequences of what I was doing.
And your dad was a minister of the church, but a dark side too.
Yeah, very dark. So he was abusing both physically, sexually, in our home, and he was a minister of a church. So that, for us as kids, that determined that we didn't want anything to do with the church. He was a high-profile Māori, so that determined for us we didn't want anything to do with Māori. So we made a conscious decision to do what we can. And we were told he's going to heaven. He'd tell us he's going to heaven. We're going to hell because we steal milk money. And we made a conscious decision not to go to heaven if people like that were going to be there. So we kind of made it so that we didn't end up in heaven.
So you talk about you had brothers and sisters and a dad in jail. I mean, how do you break the cycle?
Yeah, I freaked out because I got an older son, and he left home at 13. He ran away. He said, I want to learn my own lessons, Papa, and he ended up in care, and he ended up in prison. He's in prison today. And when he went to prison, I thought I'd failed. I was like, oh my gosh, that thing that happened back when I was 18, I've failed. And my wife reminded me that I wasn't in prison. And as long as I'm not in prison, I'm breaking that. And so I've got 3 other children, that are doing very well. Prison is nowhere in their sight. I've got a girl that's their second year at Waikato Uni. I've got an older girl that teaches kapaka, and my young boy's just finished college who's aspiring to be a rugby player. So their aspirations have lifted from my son just wanting to be like his dad, and what I learned from my older kids was how to be a bad parent. I used to tell them, don't you fellas smoke when you grow up? As I light a smoke, don't drink, I'll be drunk. And the worst, I suppose, was don't fucking swear in my house. And then I realized by the time the younger ones were born, our kids are listening to everything we do, not a word we're saying. We need to model our expectations of our kids, which is what we've done now. And the proof is in the pudding with our younger kids who've grown up. They're in a better space than the older ones.
How attractive are gangs now, do you think, to teenagers, to young people, especially to young men?
Yeah, I suppose there's still an attraction there. It's the rebellious part of young men. I had this theory a few years ago that every generation of young men in history got an opportunity to go to war until about the 70s. When they weren't allowed to join the army, so they created their own war on the streets. And so that there's still I think there's a bit of that missing in today's society.
How much will the gang patch ban have an impact on this? If you can't wear the patch, does it diminish in value? Does it reduce the attraction of being in a gang?
Yeah, I suppose ironically, it might raise the value of it. It's only not allowed to be worn in public, so there are private spaces where they're still being worn, and there are different reactions, I suppose, to the gang laws.
Are they abiding by it?
Almost are. When you look at the stats, the amount of patches that exist versus the amount of patches that have been seized, it's similar to that crime stat you had. They're not that it's not that effective in that space. And I think when you look at the reasoning that they came into space, it was about society feeling better about themselves. So if society now feels better, then it works. But this is an analogy I used back in the Wanganui days was, here's an idiot. If you take his jacket off, is he no longer an idiot? What the hell? It's about changing behaviour. It's not the clothing that people wear. So there's been different responses to that.
But you don't support that policy, do you?
Well, I don't support trying to reduce crime by changing someone's clothes. I don't support that at all.
How do gangs treat women?
I suppose back in the day, I remember I got called into a journalist asked me the question, does the Black Power treat women like shit? I went, no, we treated them all like shit, not just because they're a woman, But I think there's been a huge growth. When I first came to Wellington, there was this ban on rape. And to be honest, I witnessed more than I wanted to. And at that time, I thought, shit, some of these boys didn't get the memo. And then
what do you mean by that?
That rape was still happening, even though it was perceived to be banned among
when was this roughly?
Around the 80s. When I got out of jail, it had gone. And I looked at it, I was like, man, what happened there? So what I found is that, the wahine, the women of the men, they were identifying those that were being targeted. and they would have words with them in such a way that
So would you be comfortable with a young woman that was whānau or that you loved joining a gang?
I don't think women join gangs, at all. I think they are part of that community because their partners are patched up or whatever.
Would you be comfortable with that?
Well, I know a lot of wahine that are in that space at the moment.
And it's okay for them?
I think it is okay. If they feel good about where they are, then yes, and if they don't, then I'll support them to get out of those environments with their whānau, with their tāne. But, it's not what it used to be. And like I said earlier, a lot of good's happening in that space that just won't make the news,
You did a lot of work to try to keep gang members off P and off meth, right? And in fact, I think the Wellington chapter of Black Power for a time said it was drug-free. Was that sustainable? Is that still the case?
So, yeah, what we did was that a group of us separated ourselves from the original chapter down there, and we made our own rules and we tested ourselves. So we had drug tested every hui and that, and it was sustainable at the time. It was difficult because if someone failed a test, we had to make a decision. Do we ostracize them or do we support them? So my encouragement was, let's support them. Let's take their patch off them and say, once you're clean, you get it back. Now that worked, but we also know that there's a lot of people that are fighting addictions, and they've become victim of meth, if not alcohol, if not weed, and they're fighting those addictions. So for now, my thinking is that, relapse is part of a journey of giving up. And we know that that's a fact, and it's difficult. I remember when the mob were doing the meth program, and they're still doing that stuff, and so taking people out of the environment they're in and giving them a meth-free environment is awesome. But they're going to go back to the environment that they came from, and that was something that Roy Dunn was pro on. He was like, we got to change the environment they're going back to, and so that's something not even the state thinks about when they're taking kids off families. They don't think about the environment they're going back into. They just say, let's keep this person safe. Let's isolate them for however long. And then once we think they're cool, we'll let them go. And now it's their fault if they go back to their family, It's a difficult situation to be in.
You are a social worker. We hear a lot about this approach, this for Māori, by Māori approach. Is that something you support?
Oh, no, not at all. Sometimes I surprise myself, but more others.
Why not?
So I'll reflect on this. I was at this thing called Hui Māori at Rotorua a few years ago. I was at a table, there was about 12 of us, and there was a white man at the end of it, Judge Beecroft, kind of like the Last Supper look, Anyway, he bangs the table, and he goes, bang, it's got to be for Māori, by Māori. And all the Māori look at him and go, shit, you're a good Pākehā. And I was at the other end, and I went, bang, no, it doesn't. And they looked at me like, ooh, kūpapa, And he goes, explain yourself, bro. And I said, bro, I know some really good social workers that aren't Māori, and I know some really shit ones that are. And he goes, so what should it be? And I said, whatever works, bro. Don't think that you get a Māori kid and a Māori social worker and some fucking magic's going to happen because of the colour of their skin or the blood in their veins. There's good people that are doing some good work. If we isolate it to for Māori, by Māori, we can get stuck because there's 3 Māori at the moment that are leading this country that a lot of Māori don't agree with, But you could perceive that as being for Māori, by Māori. A lot of Māori won't agree with that, I'm sure.
So that's that takes us to 7AA, right? This part of Oranga Tamariki where it's supposed to be Māori-led, and the expectation is that you can put a Māori kid in a Māori family. What are your thoughts about that?
So 7AA, when I saw it, what it did was it made the chief executive have to give regard to their whakapapa. That's not to say they're not already doing that. I was in FGC only this week. I was in family court this week, where although 7AA isn't a focus, the social worker from Oranga Tamariki, the judge, the lawyer for child, they were all agreed that this child needs to stay with their whānau. And that didn't require 7AA, that just requires common sense. And if common sense prevails, it doesn't always, but if it does, then there's no need for legislation for people to consider that a baby has to be with their whānau.
Just a final question. You're about to get a King's Service Medal. And it strikes me that, there's real irony and tension there. This is an award from the head of state, from the King, for your work, but it was in the care of the state where you were first abused. How do you feel about that?
I was conflicted. I was conflicted when I first got, when I first got the email that was their intention, and I had to either agree or turn it down. And I know some really close friends that have turned it down for their own reasons. Yeah, I had a cordial with a good mate of mine who's also a journo, but he asked me to look at when one kaumātua got a knighthood. He had the same conflict, and he resolved it by saying, what better honour than the honour of your enemy? And then when I heard that, I was like, oh, well, that kind of works for me. And I've actually met Charles's mum, and I've met one of his kids. So, yeah, it's no biggie in my world, because I don't do what I do for recognition. I do what I do so that some people can do better, and that's really it.
Eugene Ryder, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Great to talk. That was 30 minutes with Eugene Ryder. This is 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We'll catch you next time. Ngā mihi nui.